With the Mining Indaba starting next week, Jonathan Moore, Managing Director of the Mining Indaba, joins us now from our Cape Town studios to share his thoughts on the current state of mining in Africa. Jonathan, good to have you with us. I take it that's the perfect place to start. Your view on the current mining environment across the continent. How do we fare?
Hi, Gugu. Thank you so much for having me. The reality that we face right now is very much mixed. It's been obviously a challenging time for the sector, both on the continent but also globally. I think specific to the continent, there are some other challenges that have faced us, but within that, we see some very positive things. African economies have continued to diversify and are not solely reliant on natural resources as they have been in past secular down cycles. And so we anticipate that this year we'll start to see some percolations in various areas. Certain commodities will begin to outperform others, and certain jurisdictions and countries will certainly benefit from strong legislation. And then obviously that'll translate to success for certain companies. I do think what we'll see is a continued mixed reality, and that certain companies will continue to struggle given the depressed commodity cycle that we'll still continue to see into 2015.
I want us to get into commodities in a moment or two, because you've also got an interesting guest speaker lined up to talk on certain elements of that. But I want to get your view on the cut on capex spend. Many people viewing it as though mining companies are reacting in the appropriate manner, given the cycle that we are in regarding commodity prices, as you've alluded to. But some others are also concerned by the fact that this obviously shows a slowdown in investment, which is needed to boost African economies.
It's certainly a combination of both. I think the mining companies have done fantastic work in really getting down to what core practices are going to make them successful. I think they've cleaned up their balance sheets. I think they've done the right things as it relates to their finances. But obviously there hasn't been the inflow of capital that we'd like to see into the sector. There hasn't been exploration in the manner in which that you'd expect it to be. And that will at some point start to catch up. And that was one of the things that will ultimately begin to pull us out of the cycle that we're in from a downward perspective.
What about labor? Is that still on the agenda, especially from a South African perspective?
It's always a discussion on some level. I think it's nice that we're in this year's Indaba without a current activity going on. For the past 2 years, we've been in the throes of some fairly aggressive labor strife, first in the gold sector and then in the platinum sector. So I think it's good news for South Africa in particular that we've gotten through those, and hopefully that bodes well for us keeping a consistent tone going forward.
You've also got an interesting lineup of speakers. The likes of Tony Blair will also be attending the function. Maybe if you can give us a sneak peek into what to expect next week.
Yeah, I think this is by far our strongest lineup to date. As you mentioned, former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair will be on our agenda. We've got a series of very, very sophisticated mining company presentations that will be there. Jim O'Neill, former chairman of Goldman Sachs, will be there. Dambisa Moyo, who has graced our stage in the past, will also be there. So by far one of our strongest lineups. And the new wrinkle there is a much stronger voice from the investor, and so we'll have 3 very high-level panels that will feature the investor perspective and what investors are really seeing in the sector, both globally and on the continent.
What do investors want? You've been handling the event for quite a number of years now, and I'm sure there's a consistent message. Is that message changing by any chance, especially with regard to the change in the mining cycle that we're in?
I think the answer on that is that ultimately the investors that attend Indaba and the investors that are active in the cycle understand the mineral wealth and the opportunity here in Africa. I think they are savvy enough to then, through that, pick the opportunities that are best for their portfolios. And so at any given time, it might be where they're investing more and pushing more capital into the market, and at other points, they're smart enough to know that, hey, it's time to sit on the sidelines for a little bit until the cycle works itself out.
Just on the cycle, I've read recently that you mentioned that the Arctic and Sub-Saharan Africa are underexplored and highly prospective mineralized regions. Should we be anticipating some kind of boost with regard to capex in this particular market, or in those geographic locations rather?
Yeah, Sub-Saharan Africa continues to be a star performer with respect to growth. If you look at the World Bank rankings and how those economies have continued to grow over the past few years, it's been spectacular. I do anticipate that we'll start to see some pickup into 2015, and I think 2016 will be a very robust year.
But what about the government policies and legislative environment? Is this counteracting the capex spend and FDI that we should be seeing?
It depends. I think the countries that are most successful and the countries that are garnering inflows of FDI are the ones that have consistent and transparent policies. So what investors really need is that consistency and transparency, and I think so long as that exists, they can feel comfortable about moving into a jurisdiction and putting capital to work.
Is that the trend we're seeing across the rest of the continent?
Again, varies from country to country. Certain countries have been very good at holding the course and staying on point. Again, that's in part supported by the fact that their economies continue to mature and are not solely reliant on the commodities sector. In other areas where countries are very still much one-dimensional as far as their economies, it's much harder for them to maintain policy in times of strife.
Let's get on to commodities. What kind of panel discussions or updates can we expect to hear with regard to the current commodity cycle we're in?
Yeah, so each year we have a full commodities outlook and review on the kickoff Monday of the Indaba, and we'll have that again this year. That'll feature a global panel on exploration trends and commodity trends that'll feature research experts. Then we'll have individual presentations on gold, platinum group metals, iron ore, copper, and so there really becomes this focal point at the beginning of the Indaba to lay the groundwork so that everyone understands the context of all the discussions that'll follow over the next 4 days.
I'm not too sure if you've been speaking to CEOs ahead of the event taking place next week, but what's high on the agenda for them? What are the 3 concerns that they have highlighted for you?
I haven't gotten too much from them. There's obviously a number of events that go on in and around outside the Indaba that aren't part of the main agenda that we put together as the organizers, and that's part of what makes Cape Town work at this time of year. So it all depends on which individual group is running a side event around us at that given time.
Just to close off with your view on making sure that plausible solutions or solutions that are able to be implemented actually come out from this event so that the Mining Indaba doesn't somehow turn into a talk shop. How do we ensure that this happens, Jonathan?
Yeah, well, one of the things I think is always important to remember is that the Indaba is a platform to bring together investors, mining companies, and ministers to put foreign direct capital to work in the African value chain in the mining sector. Whilst we talk about issues of sustainability, we do it in the context of investing. And so there are other platforms, the Mining Lahotla that runs in the summer, for example, that address a broader spectrum of issues. And so when we come out and look at the outcomes that we want to come out of the Mining Indaba, it's really about deal making, it's about putting investors in front of mining companies and driving that investment back into the sector.